Um, yeah, so as we hoped for, this a special session attracted an audience that is significantly larger than in our previous sessions, with many new faces and many new names. So before I give the floor to Elizabeth and Claire, I would just like to say a quick word on our network and on our research series. And after that, I will briefly outline a couple of very basic pointers on the nexus of climate change and children's work, just to provide a bit of context for today's session. So on the network, the Children and Work Network was founded almost 10 years ago now, with the aim to bring together academics, practitioners, policymakers, and working children to share and promote critical research and projects that seek to protect working children from harm and exploitation, as well as empowering them and respecting their rights as citizens and workers. And one of our main tenets is that we believe that all relevant actors should recognize and support children's systematic participation in determining their own best interest and in advancing their human rights generally. And over the last decade or so, we have grown well over 100 active members from all over the world, representing many different disciplines and organizations. And of course, we are very open to people outside of the network. And one way that we come together is through these research series. Um, they started in the spring of 2021, and since then, we have regularly come together to discuss cutting edge empirical, theoretical, and methodological research, as well as innovative NGO programs. We discussed research on children working in the suburbs of Los Angeles, in the fields of Malawi, on the streets of Gaza City, the mountains of Mongolia, in fast food restaurants in Canada, in households in Ghana, and on social media platforms in Sweden, and many more other situations. Most of these sessions have been recorded and can be viewed on our website if you're interested. And so, yeah, we today we are very proud to present the 25th edition, a special session on working children's perspectives on the climate crisis. So, just to set the scene, I thought it would be helpful to present a couple of um, insights, pointers from the available research on the topic, just to show why it's important that we focus on working children's own experiences and opinions and initiatives. Um, I will just share my screen. So the first point is really just to highlight that there is a significant lack of research and data. And one of the first reports that seriously looked into the nexus between children's work and climate change was a report by the NGO Terre des Hommes. It came out in 2017, and in their opening words, they mentioned that while doing research for this study, we stumbled over the scarcity of available data and the small amount of research carried out on this issue. And I would say that now, some 8 years later, situation is not much better. There's still very little quality research on this topic, and I think that this is partly due to the fact that the relationship between climate change and children's work is complex and multidimensional. Um, the concepts of climate change, the concept of a child, work, or labor are in themselves extremely complex and slippery, and how they intertwine and affect one another even more so. But in the research, when it comes to climate change and children's work, people look at both sort of the slow onset events, changing climate patterns, rain events, rising sea levels, as well as um, more sort of immediate shocks and disasters related to the climate change. Of course, all these things affect food security, poverty, living conditions, life prospects. There are plenty push and pull factors that are related to these different dimensions that have an effect on children's work. Migration is, for example, an important one that quite a lot of people have looked into. Um, Families moving from rural areas to urban or other places. How does that affect the way that children function within the family and in terms of work and education? Gender is, of course, another a big important dimension that a lot of research is looking at, like how are well, what are the gender dimensions to these, changing changing work well, this kind of behavioral consequences. And I do think that most work, or most research still has this assumption or works on the basis that children's work for many families remains an economic shock absorber. So we look at like how various dimensions of the climate crisis impact families and how that in turn affects children's role within the family, in particular when it comes to their work. Um, the third point is that I think the research shows that a lot of our attention should go to agriculture and rural areas. We know that the vast majority of children work in agriculture, and of those, they work in subsistence farming, which is basically families who farm, produce for their own consumption. Um, in 2023, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations published a report on the relationship between climate change and child labor in agriculture. I think, well, their conclusion is kind of interesting, right? Like, quoting, as a result, we cannot conclude that climatic shocks associated with climate change will generally lead to either an increase or a decrease in child labor of either boys and girls. I think that kind of highlights the complex and nuanced relationship between the two, but also kind of shows the limitations of quantitative research, which they have done. So basically, they looked at household surveys and statistical data on climate change to draw some conclusions. And for study countries and some of the countries, they saw that the statistical data shows that there is no increase, either in the amount of children or the number of children working, or the amount of work they do. And in some countries, there is. So again, to say that we have some research, but we don't understand much yet. And some of the policy recommendations that come from various studies are often the same. It talks about social protection policy should be strengthened. There's a whole bunch of techniques, mechanizations, information that can be improved to help people deal with the effects of the climate crisis, special seeds, information systems that warn people about incoming weather changes. A lot of emphasis is placed on better quality education programs, both to equip children and help them find better employment later on, as well as education to actually educate children and parents on climate change and the effects thereof. But most policy recommendations end by saying that we need more research and better data. And I think that what we're trying to highlight here is that research and that better data should be informed by working children's own perspective. And I just want to point out the Working Children's declaration, the Kigali Declaration of Working Children and Youth, which was drafted and adopted by working children from all over the world a couple of years ago. And I think they make it very clear that they want to be protected from labor exploitation, harsh conditions, including those of the climate crisis, to allow children to do suitable, dignified work. They ask us to listen, to understand us, and to implement laws that respect their rights. And just to finish, the closing remark of the I lost my Zoom. I'm sorry. Yes, so in the closing remark, they ask or they mention that the prevention of child labor exploitation and the promotion of children's rights at its roots requires recognition of a deeply intertwined relationship between children's rights and environmental protection and development. Okay, I've stopped sharing. That's good. So that's just a bit of context, just to give an idea of what we're talking about more broadly when we talk about climate change and children's work. With that, I'm done, and I would love to give the floor to Elizabeth. I will just introduce you, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth is now 18 years old. She is a child's rights and environmental activist from Kigali, Rwanda. She's a board member also of the NGO she's a part of, Children's Voice Today. She has 6 years of experience working with children, participating in awareness and advocacy activities on children's rights and environmental protection at both local, national, and international level. She advocates for children who are out of school, who are working, who are living in the street, who are affected by child abuse. She was on the child advisory team to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child for General Comment 26 on climate change. And she participated in the launch of the General Comment in Geneva as well. She was also a member of the Children's Advisory Committee for the Kigali Declaration on Working Children and Youth, which was drafted and adopted during the global gathering of working children and youth in Kigali, Rwanda, where we met. And she's here with us today to talk about that and to give us an example of what children are doing and what they're asking for. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Edward. It is my pleasure to have you here all today. First of all, greetings to everyone, and I could appreciate for the session for today. It is grateful and meaningful for us. I could like to start asking everyone if he or she thinks that children's participation is important. Just answer it on your side, then you will tell me next after the discussion or the presentation. So every child on this planet have lights. All those lights are like staying safe, being safe at any situation, and health and happy. That is part of the children's lights. But across the world, we still have the problem of environmental harm and climate change, which specifically affects children's life condition. This is now seen at the global situation. And absolutely true, we had been seeing about different research where children involved. Like an example, the General Comment number 26, which is a key document for the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2023. It specifically focused on children's rights in relation to the environment, climate change, and sustainable development. And the General Comment recognized that specifically there is children, and the children are closely linked to the environmental degradation and the climate change. And this context already calls for the protection of children's life. Of course, we will see and we will understand why children are important in engaging in all the matters that affect them. Therefore, children have the rights to be healthy in the environment, as you know, and have the well-being, develop, survive, and this is already connected to the environment. So the condition that they are supposed to live in may also affect them. But as a challenge, the environmental damage is linked to the children's abuse, the child rights abuse. So we see all linked to the environmental issues like the climate change, pollution, deforestation, and other resources of the depletion that affects children's health and affect the access to education over all the children's. And this calls us for action. It calls us for helping the children to participate in all the matters that affect them. And the reason why children need to participate, it is not that they are children, but their diversities may come as the opportunities. When we talk about the governments, we need them to adapt some laws and policies and actions that may help in protecting children from the environmental harm. That's including those examples of actions like addressing those different problems like climate change, and they need to quickly, effectively address to the ongoing environmental actions that may be quickly done in the way which is inclusive to all children. And when it comes to children's participation, it is a major theme to children that they should be participate, they should involve in the decision made that affects their future. And then we need to include them in the matters that related to the environment, to the climate change, and engage them in those decisions that are made at the local, national, and the international level. Because when we see all the things that we are selecting, it is specifically based to them, and they are the future generation. Even for the present generation, they are the one needed to be heard, seen, and engaged in those matters. This goes with the education and the awareness. When it comes to the education and the awareness, we found that children need to participate. Specifically, they need to participate as working children, as all those normal children, children with disability, all those children need to participate. So when it comes to the education which is needed, there is a systematic education where children could be helped to understand the challenge on the climate change, and they can be taught how they can advocate for their rights to health environments. And when it comes to the health impacts, such as some respiratory diseases caused by air pollution and other conditions like food insecurity, this is mostly affecting children at the high can go to school just because of the food insecurity. There are some areas which are affected by flooding, where this don't help to access to the education. So these are all different issues that are mostly affecting children globally. And when it comes to the climate change, it frames the children's life issues. It affects the environment directly so that the children can survive at the level that is needed. I think we are now getting the reason why children need to participate in all the matters that affect them. So when it comes to the children are not only the most vulnerable to the environment harm, but also they are the future seedwards. So at the planet and these things that we are doing today as a future generation, they need to be engaged and be involved in all the matters that affect them. So as children, we globally see that the government needs to implement and enforce the strong environmental policies. They need also children to put the international population to increase the protection of the child in the countries, mostly in those countries that are affected by the environmental harm. So children and youth should be actively involved in the conversations, actions related to the climate change and environmental protection, which goes with children's rights. About the education system, it should be inclusive and relates children's actions, consider on the children's ideas, because it is mostly important to see children's diversity as the opportunity. We could like to call for action and know that children's engagement is important because the one we are telling the story of this, they are children. So none can tell the story of children best than them because they are the one who know all the situation which goes into their daily life. They are the one who are meeting with this challenge. So we are encouraging everyone, all those non-government organizations and the government, to see children as a mirror reflection of good and great ideas at all points. Dear all who are here, children participation gives the key and the mirror of reflection, which shows an image which is good for the future and for the present. Let us work together to make an inclusive diversity and opportunity for the children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for these opening words. We look forward to hearing much more from you in the discussion. I'm sure many people will have many questions about your involvement in various projects and your perspectives on those. We'll move to Claire for the second presentation. Claire is a beloved colleague of mine, and also an international child rights practitioner and researcher with 30 years of experience with children and young people in diverse contexts. She's a qualified social worker with a master's in applied social studies and a senior associate with Proteknon. Claire is a passionate believer in the power of child and youth agency, children's collective organizing, and intergenerational collaborations for justice and rights. She will share with us today some insights and learnings from a child rights-based analysis of the climate crisis, for which she consulted with over 300 children, many of which are indeed working children. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Edward, and great to be here with you all today. And again, I was privileged to be with Elizabeth and Edward and a couple of many other working children's representatives in Kigali. And this presentation today also kind of builds upon that. I'm going to be sharing about some insights from a child right-based analysis that Proteknon supported Kinder Not Hilfe to do. Kinder Not Hilfe is a German organization that works in 33 countries around the world. It's a rights-based organization. They particularly focus on children's rights to education, protection from violence, protection from exploitation, and right to be heard. And in late 2022, they decided to develop their first global program strategy on climate change. And our team then was, got appointed to support them in that process, particularly taking forward a kind of child right-based analysis of how climate change is affecting children's rights. And Kinder Not Hilfe was one of the agencies also supporting Dialogue Works and Time to Talk that supported the working children's representatives to come together in Kigali, building on a long process over kind of more than, I think, 7 years of kind of participatory research and advocacy by working children. And so as you'll see when I describe the process, there was also a lot of collaboration of working children particularly through the Dialogue Works network that fed into this child rights-based analysis. And again, we have Elizabeth and Innocent and other colleagues here today from Kenya, I've seen from Philippines, who are part of this process that hopefully can contribute when we get into the discussion phase. So the rights-based analysis involved a kind of desk review of some key reports that already exist from some governments, from UN agencies, from a number of rights-based civil society organizations on how the climate crisis is impacting on children's rights. We had a number of 33 interviews with Kinder Not Hilfe's own staff and NGO partner staff. They primarily work through NGO, through national and local partners in Africa, Latin America, Asia, Middle East in particular. And we had interviews with 7 experts from external agencies to get their input. We developed some guidance for kind of consultations with children and young people, and we just put it out to the Kinder Not Hilfe kind of wider network and said, do any of you have the time to apply this guidance? There wasn't, the organizing team didn't have any additional budget for the consultations with children, but there was an incredibly rich response. So we had already findings from the Dialogue Works consultations, or well, not consultations, but findings from side events during the Kigali Working Children's Gathering, on how climate change is impacting on children's on working children, on side events with working children about the topic of climate justice. And we built upon some of that methodology to put together guidance that included children's views and experiences using a problem and solution tree. You can see some girls group here using this in Ethiopia. So we had separate gender groups look at how they saw any kind of climate related weather changes, what was happening in their own context, what they saw as the underlying and root causes, as well as the impact on children, and what they saw as the solutions to that, and what was children and young people's own role in being part of those solutions, as well as what had kind of helped and hindered that. Children and young people also had the chance to do draw and write about either how the climate was affecting their own lives or about their role in addressing climate or raising awareness. And again, we kind of put this short guidance out. They were for kind of 2 to 3 hour workshops, and we had I think, the 17 countries include some of the children who were part of the Kigali Declaration, but there was over children from another 12 countries that decided to do the consultations, and particularly members of the dialogue work partners. So we then had kind of 311 children who were part of the consultations. I was looking back at it, it was about, at least 260 of them were working children, and from countries where the additional consultations were taken, it was Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Haiti, India, Kenya, Lebanon, Nepal, Pakistan, Philippines, Rwanda, Tanzania, Somaliland, and Zimbabwe. So from very diverse contexts, and really just a lot of rich learning from children and young people, again, particularly working children, about how the climate was affecting them and their families' lives. And we later had participatory analysis and action planning workshops virtually, and an analysis workshop that involved partners and some young people, and action planning workshop more in person with the KNH staff, but including youth representatives from Germany, not working children, but bringing in some of the youth perspective. So this shows the problem and solution tree image that was used as one of the main activities with children. Already mentioned, they looked at the problem of how they understood it in their context, what they saw as how it was impacting on children and young people and their rights, what they saw as both the underlying and root causes of the climate crisis, but also if they felt the government wasn't doing enough, what they felt were some of the underlying or root causes of that. And then children's role in what they felt were the solutions to better address the climate crisis, to prevent and mitigate risks, to adapt or to take action on the climate justice issues. And with the cloud and sun, what were opportunities for children and young people to play a role in helping address the issues? And the cloud, what were some of the barriers that prevented children and young people getting involved? So we had, again, a lot of rich findings. Here's some of the problem and solution trees by young people in Guatemala. You can see that some of it was near the latter part of the COVID situation, still with the masks. And this rights-based analysis, again, it wasn't explicitly focused on working children's rights. It was focused more broadly on how the climate crisis is impacting on children's rights. And so I'll just share a few slides looking at some of the key principles of rights and how it's impacting, and then on some of the main rights, including the right to exploitation. Overall, both from the desk review and from the consultations from children, young people and adults, there was kind of more and more evidence that, the climate crisis is significantly exacerbating violations of children's rights. With the rising temperatures, there's more frequent and extreme weather events, there's more drought, there's floods, sometimes in the same country. In countries affected by the sea level rise is affecting, the very survival. There's more land erosion, loss of biodiversity. And there was, again, a lot of descriptive experiences, and the draw and write are very kind of illustrative of how this climate induced kind of disasters are affecting children's kind of very right to survival and development, because again, Edward mentioned it in some of the outset, but it is really reducing the loss of family livelihoods where livestock is dying because there's enough water, or because of loss of livelihoods when there's floods or extreme and longer droughts. There is loss of life in some contexts due to, the heat. Very young children are particularly vulnerable to the higher temperatures because of the kind of biological development of their bodies, are much more vulnerable to some of those high temperatures and some of the pollution that it's in the air. There's a kind of seeing again the rising food insecurity, the hunger, the malnutrition, and a lot of children and young people and talked about this. And the particular focus also not just on the physical health, but on mental health, on the stress that it's bringing to children, the worry about the changing weather and its impact, and family member stress about what's going on, and more frequent and more intense emergencies that was really testimonied in a lot of the countries where, again, both from children and from staff, from the local partners and from KNH staff. It really worsens existing discrimination and inequalities. There was discussion at one point with staff saying, is there any new violations, or is it really that it's exasperating existing? And overall, it's exacerbating existing violations of rights, but it's also exacerbating existing kind of structural discrimination where it already exists. We see that children are disproportionately vulnerable, particularly the under fives, children with disabilities, girls and indigenous, children and young people living in remote or urban poor. And again, we see with the increased climate-induced migration, there's more and more children and families coming into urban slum areas where it might be illegal places to work, there might not be access to, water or sanitation. So again, the risks increase. And those in particular high climate risk areas, if there's again the islands that are low lying and the water will come in, or and other areas where this particular climate disaster risks. We see that both the principles of children's participation and best interests are generally not not prioritized. Few governments are prioritizing. They're neither prioritizing the children's the children's views or the climate investments. Despite the kind of increased mobilization of children and young people mobilizing on climate issues, there's still generally a low status of children's views and not enough platforms for children and young people to be represented in policy making and governance to do with climate justice or other rights issues. Again, the government are not making government investments or policies in children's best interests when it comes to the intersection of climate and rights and the underlying reasons. And again, that manifests itself by the current limited resource allocations, particularly for child-focused climate mitigation, adaptation, preparedness and response. There's been some research by UNICEF looking at funding allocations, and it's very low overall, and it's even lower when it comes to, it's I don't have the data to hand, but really, really low percentage of child-focused kind of budget allocations. When it comes to the kind of areas of rights, again, we had a lot of testimonies and draw and write about how the kind of either again the floods that come as a result of the climate change, or the droughts and the extended droughts are disrupting education. School infrastructure, schools have been either destroyed, or bridges have been lost, or children haven't been able to reach school. In some countries, the schools were used as emergency shelters. So again, it disrupted education. In some contexts, children weren't able to study because it was so hot, or schools in some countries have been closed because the heat has become so high. And children described how some had dropped out or attended school more irregularly in their search for water or to generate income. So particularly where there was drought, that they were going longer distances, spending more hours of the day in search of water, that either reduced the chance of going to school, or when they did go to school, they were so tired it was hard to kind of concentrate. And it was particularly in a lot of the cultural context girls that had the responsibility to travel and search for water. And this had again impact on the right to protection from violence, where they said they were at more risks of kind of harassment, including sexual harassment and abuse when they were out in search for water. And there was descriptions of increased, and again, desk reviews and other research that's shown there's heightened gender-based violence as a result, again, when there's displacement due to the climate change, or in communities where the stress levels. Some of the children in Latin America taught that when it was really hot, their parents were more stressed and they were beaten and scolded more. And there's been some other quantitative research, but on other primary research backing that up, that's saying literally when parents get hot, their ability to deal with that stress and parent positively is also reduced. So parents are more likely to kind of beat or scold when they're when they're literally hotter. And there's been again a number of reports and some of the children talking about it, that there was more risk of child marriage because of some of the income, where the income's lost, seeing child marriage as a kind of coping strategy to get security for a child if the family had lost their livelihood, and in some context to protect the honor, that it was seen as a kind of a coping strategy. And then very much in the core area of today, in terms of protection from exploitation, the number of the children said it was increasing the risk of labour exploitation because they had lost their own livelihood. So some went more to work for other people, and they said that increased the risk of exploitation when they were earning an income with people they didn't know, rather than helping for their own families. Again, with children, particularly girls, walking longer distances, and having just the time and effort it took. With the climate-induced migration and increased urbanization, again, there were countries, some of the staff also saying that in countries where, say, a decade ago, there'd been a really reduced number of children, street-connected children. They were seeing more and more children working on the street and spending time on the street because there were more and more families coming into the urban setting because they'd lost livelihoods related to the drought and were coming there in search of work. And once children are kind of more really not finding enough family income, that again the risks of child trafficking increased, and some of the children in some contexts raised those issues. There's a draw and write example here from a 14-year-old girl in Ethiopia that says during drought there will be shortage of water. So children are ordered to fetch water from long distances. Children face different sexual and other abuse while they go a long distance to fetch water. Again, in terms of the labour, and we have some colleagues here from Kenya, so they might, again, in the discussion be able to share more. But the children had, in a group discussion, had said that climate change is a key contributor of uncontrolled child labour, since children are left with no other option but to work. And in India, where children said they were forced to work in hard climate conditions, affecting their productivity and earning. So particularly where it got really hot and they were still out working, it made it harder for them to work as long. So they had to work longer hours to get the earning they were trying to get. Again, there's a lot of desk reviews and a lot of data now particularly from UN agencies about the increasing rates of migration and displacement, especially rural to urban, that's increasing the risks of the labour exploitation, increasing risks of harmful work conditions and sexual exploitation as families struggle to meet needs. And the FAO 223 study that Edward mentioned was really interesting because, again, it shows that it's nuanced, and that even if it was not looking at the qualitative, it was still finding it was influenced by gender, and it was nuanced. So, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire, they said in that time they could see the data showed when there was heavy rain, there was an increase of hazardous work for girls, but a reduction for boys due to the same heavy rain period. While during the dry spells, there was increased hazardous work for boys. So as Edward really mentioned at the beginning, it's very complex. There's a lot of issues going on here. So it really does need like this kind of really deep deep research to really understand the context and the variables and actually what impact it has of children of different genders, of different ages, from rural, urban, or remote, and kind of what's going on. A few more pictures here. So this one was from a group in Pakistan that again have their problem and solution tree behind them and some of their key messages. And I think one of the most interesting things coming out again is the increasing risk, increasing link with justice. So some of the intervention areas that Edward highlighted at the beginning were, about the social protection and the education and some of the disaster risk reduction, but increasingly we're seeing also children and young people themselves and agencies are focusing on the justice side, because when you go to the underlying and root causes, the kind of just the link to the unfairness of that children are at the brunt of the climate crisis, particularly in countries that have contributed the least to causing the carbon footprint. And so there's much more discussion about the injustice for countries, for children, for this generation, for future generations. And I think more and more agencies and more children and young people looking at how can we work on this from a rights base and from justice issues. And Kindernot-Hilfer in their global program strategy was originally called going to be called climate change, and very quickly it changed to being about climate crisis and children's rights, and they've actually called it in the end children's rights and climate justice to more strengthen this communication on the links between rights and justice. And they have a kind of white paper they brought out, and a couple of their key messages here again of and there's, with all these negative trends of the climate, there's also positive trends of increasing human rights mechanisms linked to climate. Elizabeth talked about the general comment 26. That's a really crucial document to raise awareness and make the links. There's more and more climate litigation cases involving young people, with some successes, again some setbacks, but some successes. So the Kindernot-Hilfer have this focus on, again, the messaging around that children do have now this right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, recognition that the climate crisis is a child rights crisis, that human activities drive the climate crisis and the root causes need to be addressed, that the climate crisis is unjust for both current and future generations, and that governments, other private and civil society actors must act together now to protect children and young people. And empowering children and young people, as Elizabeth said, it's key. Children and young people want to be part of these practical efforts. They also talked about needing education that's really practical and relevant and gives them the hands-on skills to, conserve water, to plant trees that are relevant to their climate, to be part of climate justice issues. And again, the need that we need more advocacy for child-focused climate finance in countries, and we need partnerships that really support climate-sensitive interventions on child rights. And again, very explicitly in terms of protection from violence, that we need these really, I guess, go back to some of the things Edward said at the beginning, more diversified agricultural practices and regeneration that support diversified income for children and their families, and support protection from the economic exploitation, that there's an opportunity to build the stakeholders also around some of the norms that increase the risks of the gender-based violence and the sexual or economic exploitation. So some of that broader norms work still needs to be prioritized, and that we need to again work in ways that again give communities more power economically, socially, politically to protect rights and to prevent protection risks. So some of the links to some of the community-based protection work was also highlighted for Kindernot-Hilfer. But overall, there's a very strong focus on advocating for children's right to be heard and representation at kind of every level, of seeing them as key right holders can play a role, but trying to also keep the focus on governments and businesses as who have got the duty and the responsibility to be responding to this. So that's some of the key points. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks so much. That was great. I think that leads us to the discussion, and I will stop recording.